Welcome everybody to another episode of Energy Bites. John Calfan here, as usual. Today we're missing Bobby. He's still unpacking his new house and moving, so I don't envy him, and I know he wishes he could be here instead of having to unpack and move. So, but today we're here with Wes Hamer, the CEO and founder of Tasq. Appreciate you coming on, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Happy to be here. Happy to talk technology, man.
Yeah, no, you're one of my. I think I've been following you for a long time, just because you've been very not outspoken, but you've been open about what you guys are doing and what you're working on and all of that. And so I love, like I mentioned earlier, I haven't kept up with it in the last year or so just because we've been so busy. But
It's a good thing.
it's I'm excited to chat more about it because I think what you guys are doing is incredibly needed.
For sure. Yeah. It's an exciting space,
Yep.
as we talked about before. There's so much happening. It's really exciting to be building over the past 5 years and really see the transformation that's happened from 5 years ago to 2 years ago to right now.
Congrats on that, by the way.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know what the average life of a startup is, but
Yeah.
once you hit that 5-year mark, that's a
Sure.
pretty good sign, especially
Sure.
then you caveat that with the chaos that has happened in the industry over the last
Yeah,
5 years.
absolutely,
And that's a
right.
whole
like
nother.
through 2020,
Yeah.
through negative oil.
If you can make it
yeah,
through negative oil price as a startup,
Totally.
you got something.
Yeah, you get something. That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. 100%.
It might just be capital discipline, but like
Yeah.
there's lots that can go wrong, and
Yeah.
when no one is buying anything.
Totally. I think it's on the startup side, right? There's so many facets of it,
Yeah.
and you have to get so many things right? You can't you can't get 8 out of things right to move forward. You have to get 10 out of 10
Yep.
things right. It's really hard to do from a growth perspective, from a capital perspective, from a personnel perspective. What product are you in the market? How are you going to iterate? What technology stack are you building around, right?
Yeah.
You start off building V1, you have a few client requests, and that continues to grow, right? And then you have to completely cut that down. So not to go too far into
No, for
it,
sure.
John, by any means right away, but I think that's the struggle. Of course, that's the pain in it, but that's
Yep.
also the great thing about it is you have to line everything up,
Yep.
and that's fun.
Yeah, no, that's I think I remember reading Crossing the Chasm for the first time and being like, man, this is the most like enlightening thing ever, because it's just gives you a, a framework of how this works, right? How
Yep.
introducing technology products into the market works, the psychology behind all of that and all that stuff. And it's like there's so many people out there that have a good feature that they're trying to roll out as a product,
Mhm.
but they don't have any idea about like how to make it a product or why it's not getting traction or X, Y, and Z, right? And
For
it's-
sure.
That's
Agreed.
it's so tricky, and people really don't understand that. And the older I get, y'all were talking about startup masochist. That's I have that in my LinkedIn title because
I love it.
My wife asked me one day, she was like, "Why do you like the startups?" Because she's very risk averse. She's
Yep.
very conservative with
I hear
everything,
you.
right?
I hear you. Talk to me, brother.
And I was like, she was like, "Are you a masochist?" Or like whatever. And I was like,
Yep.
"No, it's just like that's what I like doing. I like building. I like impacting things and moving fast and all this stuff." But that's where
Mhm.
that kind of came from. I was like, "No, I'm a
Absolutely.
fucking startup masochist, right?" Because
Totally.
it is legit. You just like taking a beating.
Yeah. Every day, every
yeah.
day, a punch in the nose every day.
Yeah, and it takes a certain type of person and mindset to be able to deal with that, right?
Totally.
Like, and so it's
Yeah, and I think how I describe it or how I relate to it as well is, you can definitely have the masochism in you to start this company, no big capital rounds, all these things, right? Bootstrap it, all these things. At the same time, it's passion, right?
Exactly.
Going back to your point
Right.
on, I really love this and I really enjoy, and to be building right now, as we
Yep.
talked about right when I came in, is just so exciting.
Yep.
And so if I were not building right now, I would not enjoy that,
Yep.
right? That would be too much. It would be too much for me, right?
Absolutely.
to
No,
not
I
be doing
mean,
that.
that's Jessica Iriarte. I'm going to screw that up. Sorry, Jessica. She was on a couple of months ago, and she had transitioned, I think around COVID, to a tech company away from the industry. And now she's back.
Right.
She just recently came back to Corva. And that's what one of the things she was talking about was like, I was working data. Working in data is working in data, generally speaking, right?
Right.
Like you're solving problems with data.
Yep.
But she was like, but the big difference is I had no passion for the
Yep.
tech product that I was working on. My
Right.
passion is energy and oil and gas. And so it's a lot easier to suck it up and take one on the chin if you care about it
100%.
or you see the potential of it, and you see the
Yep.
future, and you care about
Yep.
what you're actually doing instead of just going in and checking the developer items
Yep.
and feature bugs and stuff like that. But
Yeah. 100%.
it's no, I think like where I was originally getting, the older I get, the more startups I work at, the more I truly realize that like the CEO's primary role is to keep the company alive. And like that's such a hard thing for people to understand.
Totally.
It's hard to accept even as a person who has been laid off from companies that that's
Totally.
all they were trying to do, right? It
Yep.
wasn't a personal thing. It was just like we got to keep the lights on.
Yeah, for
And
sure.
like that changes the way you interpret everything about
Yeah.
the company and how the decisions are made and all that stuff. And I think that's one of those really like, especially in the startup early phase and growth phase, like
Yep.
as you mentioned, you only have so many resources, people, time, and
Totally.
and there's you got to balance it. But
Yeah, it's a hard balance, and I think it's you have different phases of the company. You have the initial MVP build
yeah,
from 0 to 6 months, right? Again, what are you going to build? What are you
Yep.
going to show? How deep do you build to show, right? And that's such a balance when you're talking to clients and when you're trying to get something that is very capital efficient
Yeah.
off the ground. To get your first chance to then, get your data set, have your models working, providing value, tweaking that, talking about
Yeah.
user experience
Yep.
as they already have 10 other applications to enter in, right? Which I think is the hardest problem. You talk about crossing the chasm, but I mean, the user experience, right, is one of the biggest barriers of entry. Of course, you can talk about IT. Of course, you can talk about data and all these other aspects that can become barriers as well. But man, how the user enters, the platform, what are they going to do? How is that in the overall ecosystem of the client's software systems? That's really hard to figure out. And so if you can't figure out you can't figure that out, you can't figure out utilization.
Yeah.
Right. And if you can't figure out how the platform is going to be utilized, because you have all these, and if that's not defined. And so, it's absolutely a journey. And I think a lot of it is working it backwards from that user. Right. And that's, you kind of go into it with, hey, I've got this vision. Hey, this is a better way to do it. But you're not really working backwards from that.
Yeah.
So there's kind of a coming to a head. And I think you have to change your direction and how you're going to build your technology.
Yeah. No, I think you're spot on there. I was very fortunate to kind of learn that early when I was interning, actually. It was an industrial engineering internship. We were doing all kinds of 5S, Six Sigma stuff. And I don't remember what the process we were trying to optimize was, but the first thing I did was go talk to the guys on the line that were actually manufacturing it and doing it. And guess what? They have a long list of things that they've already tried that don't work, that are probably overlap quite a bit with the things that you're coming to the table with. And it's like,
100%.
you got to start with the user and work back.
Totally.
We've had a number of conversations about like, is Excel a good place for an end user to be able to use data? And the answer absolutely, in my mind, depends on what the user is doing. Are they comfortable and understand Excel? And that's where everyone works.
Sure.
It's probably the best place to serve the data as long as you can structure it and put boundaries on it and all that fun stuff. But other times it's not, right? It's like, especially in our industry too, right? People do not like change. Generally speaking, people don't like change. It's hard. And then once you're in the enterprise stuff, it gets so much harder to introduce change into that.
100%. Yeah, and I think that change, predominantly has been, hey, we're going to have this new platform, this new tool, this new software, but it's not really defined, what we're going to get out of it, what the stage gates are, what the plan is for 1 year, for 2 year, how it's going to be used, right? And this is pretty basic, right? But there's rarely that top-down communication when you do have this software partnership about, let's talk about the how, right? Let's talk about how it's going to be used. And so I think that these simple things and just communicating and having a clear path, I think stem also from, what's your strategy towards technology? That's a broad freaking thing to say. But at the same time, I don't see much strategy, right? You kind of see, hey, look, we want to get, our digitization here, and this is level 1 and level 2 and level 3. But beyond that, there's not really a working strategy, right? What software are you bringing in? What software are you bringing out? What's your thesis here? What are you building internal versus external? Somebody might have a snippet of things. Well, if there's something external on the market that's better than what we have, it's not really the case, right? Because you have all these other things that you have to fight. So Yeah, it's very real. I think at the same time, it's a really challenge to the software companies out there.
Yeah.
You've got to be fucking good,
Yep.
right?
No, it's true.
You can't go in there selling a same flavor of X.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to really integrate within a day. You've got to have data at that first person's fingertips to make a decision that's better and automating all their workflows and all their tedious things, right? All of that has to happen within the user experience upon onboarding.
You're right.
Right?
Yeah, it's not a 6 month.
We can't can't just accept the narrative of like, okay, this integration is going to be a year integration. It's going to be a 6 month integration. That's crazy. That's absolutely nonsensical, right? So I think that it's on the software companies to be able to have a 10x product, a true 10x product across all these user things that they're doing on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, no, I'm right there with you. And it's only getting harder because software and UI UX is getting better, right? And so it's like, that's the thing, and you're spot on with it, right? Like you look at the kind of energy, oil and gas software space historically, you've got these big giant incumbents that are still operating on the same architecture that they were operating on 20 years ago. And they never changed for a variety of reasons. A lot of it, in my opinion, was they didn't have enough competition. Or then you've got all this, of course, the oil and gas cycles play into that and all of that. But it's one of those things that, you look at like Combo Curve, right? Like Combo Curve comes along. It's like, hey, we're going to do this in the cloud. And it's like, not to water down what they're doing. To make it sound simplistic or whatever. But like that jump was a step change for most users because, hey, now I can throw as much compute as I want to instead of having to be limited by whatever resources I've got available. I worked for a basin modeling company for like 4 months, and one of their big like value adds was I think Petrel was limited at that time to, I don't remember, 6, 8, some number of clusters or CPUs, and then theirs didn't have a limit. And so like the Petrel models would literally take 2 weeks to run these huge ass basin models, right? Which was like, holy shit. I didn't know that existed at all, right? Like they're literally mapping the evolution of the ground over centuries and stuff, or centuries. And it's but yeah, I was like, holy shit, you mean like they just click a button and then go away for 2 weeks and then come back and then hope that the model ran properly? Like that's a crazy workflow. And there's so many of those and still, right? Like, it's just a crazy.
Well, the architecture problem about how you run the models, right? And how you're iterating. I mean, it's still painful, right? It's still, how do you also productionalize that? Are you training, this data set and you're trying to look for, what is my scorecard here for this model? What am I benchmarking that off of? How is that continuous? I mean, there's so much in that. And to your point of, you run the model and, it runs overnight, it runs for 2 days, right? It runs for a certain amount of time, and then you're going to review the results, right? Like even that is challenging to do, right? And so even just the basics of getting it set up, you can come in with a lot of, whether it's configuration issues, whether it's data issues, whether it's
so complicated, right? It's all multivariate, like theoretical, and there's so many knobs and stuff.
So that's like the building blocks of building the model, right? Putting it out into a production environment and putting it out to a production environment where you're making predictions of a suite of models every day. Whether it's, generative models, whether it's, time series models, whether it's, image models, whatever the case might be, right? That continual cycle, there's a CI/CD to it. There's a continuous improvement of it. There's how are you going to, update that model? What is your scorecard? And how do you do that on a day-to-day basis? And how's the model improving? So, wow, there's just a lot that is, I would say, not too much talked about, right? Because everybody says, hey, here's a model. Okay, well, I'm going to plug your model in and plug this model out. Okay, well, how are you thinking about doing that, right? What's your architecture? How are you guys set up right now? And then it's quickly.
Then 3 months down the line, they're like, oh yeah, well, we've got this new thing that we want in it too. Can you do that? Like, oh shit. Or you build a POC and then it starts gaining traction. You're like, well, shit, how do I productionizing that is a whole nother level. And then once it's in production, like you said, taking it and it's a continuous improvement, continuous development thing. Like it never ends. I think that's what people don't realize about software. It never stops. There is always a bug. There is always a new feature. There is always an improvement, something, right? And so that's no, that you
And how is that, very, operating very smooth for the client across, of course, many clients here.
Yeah, but also as a startup trying to streamline that so you're not
Totally.
outspending.
Yeah. And I was just chatting with Colin about this, right? But what you put out as your V1, right? Your MVP, what you're putting out for users to use. This is something that we've, I would say, been pretty sensitive to how we do this in the market, because your first version, well, you're going to get client request one. Well, can we change this? And well, can we add this? Well, really, I want to know this, right? And so you're iterating around that product, right? You're trying to answer all these questions for users because they have all these complex workflows, and this is a workflow game in E&P, especially in oil and gas. Is you have so much underlying workflows that the product is not even touching right now. It might be touching 10% of that right now, right? And it's so important to put a scalable MVP, what is the future going to be, out there first and iterate off of that, right? And so I would, for anybody trying to, or think about, building their own software, trying to put it out in the marketplace, really go to the market with, I think that the common advice is, you should be embarrassed about your MVP that you put out. And of course, there's some truth to, you can't have everything refined perfectly and you just have to go. But at the same sense, man, it can bog you down, right? And we've kind of been in that cycle where we had to tear everything down and rebuild everything up because we were continuing to patch or to fix the things, but we didn't want to fix those things, right? So you're stuck in this cycle of, fixing things that you don't really want to fix. And if you thought about this problem in a different way in the beginning, wow, if we could only have iterated around that to start. So I think that's also an important part on the software side, on how you're developing and how you're pushing to production, how you're iterating is huge.
Yeah, back to the masochist.
Back to the masochist.
How many startups have torn down and completely rebuilt
some
portion, if not all of their stack multiple times in their lives?
100%.
No, that's it's spot on, man. And so actually, I've got a question for you around that. What strategies, techniques have you seen that work and don't work around managing that? Because it is such a fine line in the startup space, especially on the energy tech and the tech world of POC, just, move fast, break stuff and iterate quickly. But there's ways to move fast that don't scale. And there's ways to move fast. And then normally the scalable things take longer, so you can't move as fast, right? And you've got the whole project management. You got 3 things, right? You can only have 2 of them.
I love this question, Joe. This is great. How we've done it is, in the beginning, of course, getting a POC or getting something out there in the market is the biggest thing that you need to do to engage the market on what the future can look like and how does it look like with Tasq, with whatever the company is.
Seeing is believing too. Like, people
100%.
Undervalue that.
100%.
It's like
you have to have
an algorithm that does something in the background and then spits out something is not nearly as good as letting the people actually see it, letting them have the hands-on with it and all that
100%.
stuff.
And so I think you have to, of course, there's other ways to approach the market. You can say, hey, if we're going to build X, Y, Z, would you be interested? It's harder to do with enterprise. I've heard these stories, I've seen some of it happen. And so I think it's a way to create demand, and that's completely fine. It's another way to start off. And then you start really trying to build this thing, right? And so we get our first few contracts, and we're trying to build this in the background to make sure that we're connecting the pieces together. And so what database are you going to pick? How are we going to deploy our models? How is the feedback going to feed back into the models? Again, what's the scorecard of accuracy? Well, can we even measure accuracy right now? Or are we worried about our database?
Or I was going to say, is it on-prem or in the cloud? And then that changes everything.
No, we early on, we're like, look, we're not going to do anything on-prem, right? It was like, this is so much easier to do in the cloud. This is the path we're going to take. But to your point, even on that small thing, right? That was almost it could have been a concern. I don't even know, 10 years ago or something like that. Oh, you're in the cloud and there's still companies thinking about that. Well, our data sensitive and I'm kind of scared about this. We haven't really done that before. And I'd say that's just technology in general, right? And how people are viewing what is acceptable risk or not.
Right.
And I think that's some of the problem, right? When you talk to
absolutely.
A bunch of organizations.
It's all about risk. Once I realized that in the industry, like, first and foremost, think about the risk with any decision or any product that you're trying to introduce. It changes everything.
Yes.
Is because I was so jaded for the longest time about like, why are we so slow with adopting technology? Why is this like, we have all these people working on this really cool shit, and there's
Right.
really low hanging fruit problems that we can solve today with the combination of SMEs and tech and everything.
Yep.
But somebody broke it down to me, and they were like, Facebook having 12 different models and then you not being able to get notifications is a very different risk than,
Right.
a drilling rig blowing out
Yes.
or,
Yes.
Macondo
Yes.
or things
Yes.
like that,
Yes.
right? Like,
100%.
and that's how they think about these things.
Yes.
And once you can approach it from that mindset, it definitely helps.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think to that point, it means you have to have a high degree of accuracy, right? You can't, in the day and age of, hallucinations of AI or, referencing wrong data or coming up with wrong predictions.
It's not just accuracy, it's explainability too.
It's explainability too, yeah. And so you kind of have to get all these things right for the users to trust the system, also for the system to continue to be valuable on a day-to-day basis. And so I think that's always going to be a challenge, right? And the biggest companies in the world are still facing this as a challenge.
Yeah.
How do you get it right for specifically the problem that you're trying to solve is really the key. But I'll go back to it. You asked me, what did we, how do we build and scale? Because I think it's a really important question. Yeah. There could be, I think you could create a whole nother podcast on this, right? From everybody.
Absolutely.
Which is super interesting to me. But yeah, I think you have to take some type of MVP approach. I'll maybe break this down to 4 things, right? You have to take some MVP approach to get it out there, engage the market, and get it stood up, right? And that's like version, that's the first step, right? And then you're trying to scale that technology out, making sure that you're building around the right things, right? And then the third is really, what is your differentiated technology? Right. And then how do you really scale the business from there?
Yeah.
And, I would suggest really trying to understand that before you start building, of course. Sometimes it doesn't exactly happen that way. And sometimes it happens, of course, through trial and error, right?
Yeah.
And that's why you have to rebuild things, because what we know now absolutely would not have architected it this way from the start, right? Or built this way from the start.
Well, even the tools available, right? Like,
the tools available. Oh my
time.
gosh, the tools, the tool set within, it's like what's your stack? And it's like, 12 lines, it's like 30 lines, right?
Yeah.
It's like, it's not just like 3, right? Where you're not like, hey, I'm in AWS.
AWS SQL.
Yeah. It's not that anymore, right? It's like, what are you using for blogging? What are you using for, identification? What are you using? CI/CD, right? Like, what are you using for deployment? What, all these things. So, I think the key thing that I would say out of all that is really focus on what your differentiator is going to be. And this is, sometimes you have a pretty good idea of that at an overview when you're starting up.
Right.
But, I think as you start getting more into it, right, and you start understanding the data more, and you start understanding what the models are doing and understanding, how you can make these different connections, then you have to go really deep, really quick. And by going really deep, really quick, that means that you can't spend time on managing a database, right? You can't spend time on, these other peripheral things that you shouldn't be controlling. And there's a relatedness to the EMPs out there, because it's the same problem that they're dealing with that you deal with in software about. Again, it goes back to your strategy of how we're going to do this. What am I going to spend time on? What am I going to not spend time on? And there's, some EMPs trying to create their own database. Like, what do you, why would you do that? That's like, there's a billion databases out there that do a much better job.
Yeah.
And so I would really target that, right?
Absolutely.
As find what your IP, find what your core thing at doing well that you can scale up, that, really works, that you've seen work and is differentiated.
Yeah.
And spend the most time that you can there.
Yeah.
And sometimes that goes through cycles to figure that out.
Yep.
If I, could do it again, I wish we would have figured this out at the beginning and just gone deep there. Right. And so I think we tried to, in the beginning, we tried to paint this more holistic version of operations and all these things. And by no means was that wrong, but the entry point and then how do we scale up from there is really important.
Yeah, no, that's the trickiest part about software, in my opinion, is that it's iterative and there's building blocks, right? And so you're selling the future state, but you're trying to get there through the guidance of your users as you're building towards what you think is the future state, and then the users help kind of direct that or put bumpers on it on either sides of it as to where you go. But It's yeah, it's such a hard thing. I think you nailed it though, because there are one. I don't. I'm curious to know your thoughts on this, but I don't know why so many people in our industry like are so adamant about doing everything themselves or internally. It makes no sense. That's
Sure.
not how most.
Yep.
That's why tech exists.
Right. Totally.
And so, like, yeah, even internally, right? Like, the reason this whole podcast came about was because Bobby and I were talking about data, and he told me about Fivetran. It's like, oh, I'd never heard of Fivetran before. Let me look at this. I was like, oh shit, this does everything that I need it to do, and it's a few $100 a month,
Right.
and I don't have to do it. And if the APIs change or the auth changes or whatever, I don't have to mess with it. They just do it,
just
right?
Time,
like,
right?
yeah,
it's like taking time away from my plate.
Yeah,
right?
and it's like, okay, I could have hired an intern or a junior dev for however much, and this is maybe a few $1,000s a year. Yeah, that's a very easy ROI. Like, why would we custom do this stuff if something else can do it quicker, faster, and cheaper than me? That's literally the definition of technology, right?
Yeah.
Like, and so it's God,
I think with that, I would say I think the reason why, the industry, back to your point on why would you build X, I think, again, it goes back to not having to define strategy about what you're going to build, what you're not going to build. I think within EMPs, it's, and you can't discount the EMPs because they're every day they're dealing with these problems. So they have to solve it, right? They can't just say like, hey, I'm just going to wait for, us to find something, right? And maybe something comes along in our lap and then that solves X problem. And so you're kind of you're stuck in that pattern. And usually that's the way that you're operating. You're operating every day and there's always false positives or reports not showing up, right? Or, the database is completely loaded or, all these things that happen on your day-to-day basis. And so that is naturally getting worked, right? Now, I think it's been hard for EMPs to make the determination about what do they really want to put the efforts in to fix that. And, I think that's some of the challenge. And you've going back to your question on, why is it the way that it is? You have these build and buy cycles, right? And I am a firm believer that, of course, technology is everywhere and you can, that you can go to AWS Marketplace and sync up the technology tools of your choice, right? And get started. But at the same time, there's been this build and buy where everybody thinks that they can build, right? And so you're going through that and being a part of that, number one, and then also seeing building software, on the other side as a technology company. You very much see the effort required, going back to the first points that we were talking about, to manage, to deploy, to do all these aspects of building software in the right way.
Right. That
man, it's a challenge, right? And it's a challenge to continually improve that.
Then you throw commodity cycles on top of
Absolutely.
it. And it's like, Bill wrote all that, and now Bill got laid off, and there's no one to manage or maintain it. And you're like, we should have bought it from so and so. Like, hey, that makes a lot of sense.
And so there's many stories like this, right? It was very true, and we've come across many companies that have had this exact story. And like, this guy left, and now we're left with nothing, and so we need something holistically right now. And it's like, okay, perfect. Let's have a conversation about what's best for you guys. But I think you have to go through that build cycle, right? And you have to go through the failure.
You have to go through
the pain. You're embarking on something that you're not an expert on, right? And the barrier of technology is coming lower and lower.
Right.
And so there is that intersection. What is that right intersection?
Right.
I'm not sure, right?
Yeah.
But I think you have to go through the failure of that.
Absolutely.
And then you are better poised to make that decision.
I completely agree. You don't, I mean, it's so true, right? Like, and I remind myself with my kids of this, right? Like, you don't know what you don't know, right? And like their worst experience is their worst experience, right? Like that, it doesn't mean it's worse than yours, but it's just their worst personal experience.
Their perspective.
So, exactly.
Everybody's perspective is real, right?
It is, until you go through that, I think that is really where you can have a much better understanding of like, okay, maybe we should look at outsourcing this or whatever,
Agreed.
To that point, let's talk about Tasq.
Sure. Let's do it.
Tell the world what, if they don't know, which most of them probably do, but what you guys, kind of what your thesis on how it came about, what you guys do now, kind of, I'll pepper you with questions while I'm talking about it, I'm sure.
So we're Tasq. We're focused on production operations. We are the AI OS of operations. what we're doing is we are plugging in SCADA data, plugging in production allocation data, and then assigning that work out to control rooms, to field technicians, to engineers on a day-to-day basis for many issues that happen within operations. We're doing work documentation, and then we're doing production reporting off of that as well. And so if you think about your kind of holistically how an operation is run, I would say if I could, summarize or generalize this for the whole industry, nobody really knows what people are doing on a day-to-day basis, right? Like at a very
at the field level for sure.
Very high level, right? Nobody really knows. And it's because you don't have you don't have models that have a high degree of accuracy to be able to understand these issues.
You mean my paper forms aren't good enough?
Yeah, right. Yeah, operational in a lot of companies still, right? And if you don't have that high degree, because everything is alarm based, everything is threshold based, everything is potentially a SQL query, can have models, right? But those models are usually, somewhat pointed on a specific issue and not, I would say, holistic to work management, what everybody's doing to day to day. So I'd say at our core, we're really trying to pair time series intelligence with work management.
Yeah.
And I think that's a different, if you think about those two disciplines, there's usually one or the other, where traditional work management is, hey, Jim, I'm going to assign you a job. Jim, can you do that job? Okay, Jim checked it off. But there's a performance aspect to it, right? There's all this production happening at the wellhead. What's normal? What's abnormal? If you can't benchmark what the well should produce, and reservoir curves have problems, and 30-day averages and different models have different issues here. And so really pairing this all together about what should happen on a day-to-day basis. Yeah. Because if you have a list of, let's just say, 10 things for whether that's field technician, engineer, control room operator, what we find out is about 65% of that list is noise, right? Yeah. It's flush production, it's variance, it's
random outliers,
comms, it's all these things that don't really need action. Maybe it just needs a set point change. You don't have to go visit on site. And so really trying to take all of that together to intelligently dispatch work on a day-to-day basis.
Well, I mean, the simplest example of that, right, is like, well, the production curve looks weird. Well, why? Well, I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, it's because Jim was out there messing with pulling tubing, right?
And
no one knows that because the data sets are completely isolated.
100%. Right? And you compound that by the amount of things that people are doing every day, right? And nobody knows that he just changed the set point from X to Y, right? And that's the reason why it's off. Well, how do you know all these things, right? And so it's about connecting these different data sources and models too to better explain operations, but to also predict what should happen, right, for tomorrow, for the next day, and so on. And so, I think we've been on a journey for about 5 years. We've developed different versions of our technology stack in different ways with different strategies, which, happy to go into that as well. And I think really, for us, we're continuing to be that voice and that, one system where you can tie all these things together that have been fragmented. And right now, users are using 10 different systems, 5 different systems, right? Even if you're using 3, like 3 should try to understand what's going on a day-to-day basis is too much, in my opinion.
Well, and they're probably all different departments, and they're all different databases, and none of them talk to each other.
Yeah. And so I think it's how you connect it all. And then it's what can you do adjacently when you connect it all to really leverage up. And this is, say, the interesting spot that we're in right now.
Yeah, no, you're spot on. I think there's so much opportunity in this industry because of the silos, right?
Yes.
And because coming from that, I worked at in industrial internship for 2 summers, and coming from that 5X, lean manufacturing, we literally had stopwatches. It took anywhere from 12 to 24 hours to know we were building wind turbine blades, ironically enough. And I literally was out there with stopwatches, and we focused on, okay, where do the tools need to be so that it takes the worker the least amount of steps to get to them when they need it. And all these optimization things. Then I go from that to working as a frac engineer, and it's I look outside and there's 20 sand trucks sitting there charging to merge because no one told them that we screened out. And but at that point, natural gas was whatever, $5-6, and oil was over 100. No one gives a shit.
Doesn't matter.
Right. That's another crazy part of our industry, right? Is once oil exceeds a certain price, no one is worried about optimizing anything. They're
Right.
always worried about just getting it out of the ground as fast as they can
Right.
before it
Right.
drops back below.
Yep.
And then prices go negative or they get super low, and then everybody's worried about optimization again. And it's just the same cycle over and over.
Right.
It's painful, but it opens this door for so much opportunity, especially just around that. Like, hey, this is a workflow that happens across multiple silos in the industry, multiple data sets, multiple databases, whatever. But look at the power that can be had by unifying these things and leveraging up, like you're talking about. So let's get into that. What's kind of in y'all's tech stack? How do you guys kind of do that? What are some of those big, value added things that come out of that? I can only imagine. My first job in the oil field was as a production intern, riding around with the pumper and doing all kinds of random stuff. And so it always blew my mind that the traditional way for like the field side of the oil field to work, at least around production, was the pumper has his scheduled route and he just goes out there and checks on them.
Right.
And it's like, what?
Yeah,
I can watch my front door from my phone, but this guy is just driving aimlessly on the same route, regardless of what is actually happening to all the equipment and stuff every week or every month or whatever it may be. It's like, it's insane.
Yes, it is insane. So right now, I mean, we're obviously taking those workflows and optimizing that for what should be done on a daily basis, right? And taking out all the noise, focusing on what is actionable and focusing on the type of action. Type of action can be remote, type of action can be on site, type of action could be troubleshooting, type of action can be, many various things. It could be different workflows. And I think, we're, the workflows are challenging, right? Because when you really think about, like you're talking about all these systems being very siloed, and thus is the opportunity 100%. And so how do you really connect those data pools together, the models, but also people who need to do different things, because the measurement tech or the measurement analyst could very much need to be, it could meter calibration, or it could be at scale, or if we're picking up meter calibration as an issue, right? Well, that's not, going to the field technician, right? It's going to this other user. That's a different workflow. And if he has to order parts, well, that's, that's a different complexity, right? And so that's the hairiness that we're dealing with. But at the same time, there's massive opportunity. But your question, sorry, was on the tech stack side.
Yeah. What's in y'all's stack? How'd you kind of architect this? Any fun lessons learned or
lessons learned?
I'm sure there's lots of those. Cool things that you would recommend or not recommend doing.
I mean, I think again, we're dealing with a lot of time series data, and we're dealing
SCADA data. Right?
Really good SCADA data, good quality. Tubing pressure is labeled, at least 20 plus different things. TB7 and T19. What's T19? Well, it's tubing pressure. So a lot of it is in the driver, in aggregating that data, in cleaning the data, and prepping that for a model. I mean, I think a lot of our issues have been on the management of data, right? And are we trying to manage that? Are we paying for different components to manage that as well, or different databases to manage that? So again, it goes back to, what schema, how are we generating IDs? How are we generating unique IDs? Well, man, if we could just push that off to somebody else to manage, where we can focus on, really for us, the things that we're really focused on is how do you label data at scale and produce models at scale? And I think that's the unlock that we continue to edge closer to, and is really exciting. There's different ways to do that, right? We have, millions and millions of labeled data, right? So what do you even do with the labeled data, right? How can you turn that into models at scale when, the next client uploads their whole data list? We have 15 models that we have generated for the client based off of their data. We're getting to that point now because we've stopped fucking around with our database. And so that's freed up time for us to focus and iterate on the right things. Which is all the management of, how we're going to do IDs, how, what's your equipment store, what's your model store, what's your SCADA database, what's your, your edited database, how are you changing your workflows, how are you updating that data? And so all of that flow, we were trying to, I would say, manage in the beginning, right? And we've found some better solutions to manage that for us, and we can really focus on the next pieces of it.
Yeah, no, that's like a perfect example of what we were talking about earlier, right? Like doing that for a POC where it's like, okay, well, someone can just go manually relabel or like map these headers or come up with a key that maps things over and stuff. And it's like, but that doesn't scale once we get to a certain point. So it's like, okay, now we're going to use models because we have enough data to actually train a model on it to do these things. And those are the things that like the average person just has no clue about, right? Like scaling to one customer versus being able to quickly scale to dozens, especially with, I'm sure, the variety of data sets that you get is a whole nother ball game.
And you have data that's organized in many different ways, right? You've got data, you've got obviously historical data, you have new data coming in, you've got, classification models that you're currently running on. How do you backfill some of those if you have a new classification model that you wanted to test against?
Backfilling is like the bane of every data engineer's existence.
100%. Yeah. So much. And that's one example out of, like 50, right? But how can you do all that stuff from your data management, and how can that all be seamless where you're not screwing around with that? And I think that the interesting things that we're focusing on right now is, I think there's different techniques for labeling data that I think can be really, really impactful to build these future models. And so that's what we're currently focusing on for release over the next months is to do that. So you could search for any type of issue that can automatically pop up and create your own workflow from that within operations.
Let's unpack that, because I was having this conversation earlier I think earlier this week with somebody else. But I think a lot of people, even myself included, right? Like the way that you have to approach data at scale changes, especially with all the tech tools that have come out over the last few years and stuff. But like traditionally, if you're building a relational database or whatever, you have to come up with the schema, and you have to come up with all the semantic things and variables and naming conventions and all this stuff. And it's like, but the best way to do that is actually let the data tell you. Right. 100%. And so that's it's literally the opposite. 100%. Right. And so, but when you do that, it's way better. It's way more flexible. It's way more accurate, all of these things. And so can you kind of just talk about that in general? How that has 100%. Gone, any improvements and stuff you guys have seen because of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're spot on, right? The engineer in the beginning is providing that structure, and then you find a billion cases, right? And it's always a fringe case, and it's like, well, fringe case, well, it didn't fit, this schema, so we have to think about how we, well, should we create another table? Okay, well, how does that link to? Well, we have all these workflows, and well, we have to run a different process, right? And so you've just taken one fringe case that has blown up
for one customer,
right? That has completely just like blown up your whole time on a Friday, because you have to re-architect, re-engineer it.
It's always on a Friday.
Yeah. And so, I think you're spot on in that, where it was human driven before in creating a somewhat of a limitation there. Whereas now you can look at the data and say, hey, can you provide me a schema, or what are the best outputs based off of this data, based off of all this data that you have at scale for recommending even data labeling, right? This is where we're at right now in our technology lives. And it's so exciting because you can let the machine, you can let the model, you can let, any different form of AI do it for you. And this is really about how do you leverage AI and different models in different ways to optimize the whole workflow. It's not just that AI is a model and how do we use it in this EMP to tell me all the answers today. It is embedded into how you develop, right? And how you run, all your different facets of operation, of structures, of data structures, of labeling, all these things.
Well, it makes you so much more dynamic too, right? Like when you get those outlier cases where you get a new customer or a new data set that you're not accustomed to, or like it wouldn't have fit in your old schema because it was new or different. It's like, oh, well, I don't have to worry about that anymore. Right?
Totally.
Like, I don't have to rebuild this or figure out all these relationships and all this other shit. No, I think that's one of the
and it's always like, where do you put the injection point there, right? If you're going to generalize what data types you need, right, and how to, it's somewhat not not, so generalized, right? But it's not so specific where you're
Right.
defining the schema, right? There's a middle ground there that I
Yep.
think is a better sweet spot to
Yeah.
operate in.
Yeah. No, I think that's I think Diana asked me about what my thoughts are on AI and how people are going to use it and all of that stuff. And that's one of the biggest areas that I think is being so slept on. Is like,
Yes.
obviously it's, worker augmentation, acceleration,
Sure.
whatever.
Sure.
But there is so much, I mean, even like on a weekly basis, there is new stuff that comes out on like, oh, hey, now we have this way to map this entire PDF document and all the shit that's in it and the images and label them and pull like,
Yes.
and like that would have taken a human so long to do at scale. And that's what they've been trying to do with OCR, for example, like forever.
Yes.
And
Yep.
it's like, but now you can feed, I got a bunch of metadata on a lot of our sources for our language model by OCRing the first few pages of the content, feeding it into GPT and saying, give me the author title and all this stuff.
Absolutely. And it works really well.
Really well. And it was pretty damn instant compared to me doing it by myself.
Time doing it 100%.
No, or like we would have, when we had like big data problems, we would distribute that across the company and be like, hey, we just need everybody to go pick, here's your 20,
relabel,
you go knock these out, right? Like, no, I just feed it into a model now and it's done. And it's crazy.
Yes. And I think that is a fantastic point. 100% agree. And what it tells me is that it's just about pace of iteration, right? And everything is pace of iteration, right? If you can take tomorrow's problem and solve it within 30 minutes, where 4 months ago it took you a week, that's what we're after, right? Because pace of iteration for all of these problems is how quick can you solve a problem? How quick can you scale it up to market? How quick can you take these problems within market in a more scalable fashion, right?
With limited resources.
With limited resources, right? And so, I think there's a, there's a huge amount of value that can be created by doing this right.
Yep.
And just to your point, the inner workings are, how do you put that all into your development cycles? How do you take all this time that you're spending doing this manual effort, doing all the, all these things?
It's manual effort that humans hate doing.
Yes.
Humans are flawed. We make mistakes. And we'd also, even in that example that I gave, where it's like, if I would have given it out to the company and had them label departments on jobs or something, right? Like each person would pick different things different ways, where it's like, if a model does it, it's going to do it the same way every time. At least I have that consistency, right? Like as an engineer, that's what I would much rather have a model doing it than a human doing it. Yeah, right. Like the human performance is going to degrade over time, just like everything else. And guess what? It's what humans or technology is for. That's what computers are good at. It's all the mundane shit that humans hate doing.
Yes.
And aren't get lazy about or, make errors with, right? And so it's like,
well, I think 100% spot on. And in the normal day-to-day work, right, there's just so much BS that everybody has to deal with at the enterprise and within EMP. And you've got your reports, and then, but you need to update your slides for Tuesday, and then, but you've got to fill out you've got to check your downtime because everybody filled it out wrong, right? So the whole construct of what everybody's doing on a day-to-day basis is packed with meetings and packed with work based off of those meetings and packed off of reporting to feed on up because everything's messy.
Right.
And so the value, everybody thinks that, well, AI is going to tell me everything to do. It's less, I would say, and this is probably something that I've definitely changed on. In the beginning, it was like, hey, we can proceduralize this and say, hey, this is step 1, this is step 2, and so on and so on. But the value is just in taking out all this BS work, right? Where people can actually have the time to iterate on the next thing and go from there. And that's where the value is, right?
No, let the human do the things that the humans are good at.
Yes.
That you can't teach a computer.
Yes.
And let the computer do the boring, mundane shit that we don't like doing anyway.
Right. And the boring, mundane shit is like 80% of work
absolutely.
right now, right? Like it's just way too much.
Yeah. No, that's
in the digitization age, right, where you stand up your first forms and you stand up your first environments and all this stuff, right? We're now trying to redo that, almost in a sense, right? Okay, this data gave us some good clarity onto optimizing certain things. That's good, right? That's progress. But it's like now you're spending your whole time managing this, and you're kind of at a plateau.
Right.
And how do you break through to that plateau where you're not managing this initial digitization effort that you stood up because it's not intelligent?
Yeah.
So I think that's where we're at right now, right?
That's awesome. No, I love hearing that. I love this period of time in the industry because there's so much cool shit happening in the industry as a whole. but then two, overlay that with all the tech stuff that's happening, and
Yep.
I'm very bullish on
Yep.
our industry moving forward because of
Totally.
all these things. But
Yeah.
man, no, that's well. So since we're talking about AI, everybody wants to talk about AI.
Yeah.
What,
Yeah. Sorry. It naturally goes.
no, I mean,
there.
absolutely. It's well, I mean, like we said, it's really useful in a lot of different ways. And I
Totally.
think that's where there's so many creative ways that we're not even talking about or thinking of that people are going to be using these things to
Yep.
accomplish all kinds of stuff. But
Absolutely.
how do you see AI kind of, or let me refine that. How do you see kind of the language model trend, boom, et cetera, impacting the industry or people in general?
Yeah, absolutely. It's impacting, as we were talking before, right? The amount of progress with LLMs is just, I mean, the pace is just
It's
absolutely
nuts.
crazy, right? I think if you look on, the models that have had the best scale over time has, we're in the stage where
Mhm.
LLMs have absolutely taken over. And I kind of come at that from a perspective of even just think about time series
Yeah.
data, right? So if I could, paint a picture black and white of time series data and the progress of LLMs, right? Like LLMs with, you know, post BERT
Yeah.
breakthrough, right? And the initial versions of GPT, you were kind of taking those steps and then you take this just drastic
Yeah.
step up, right?
Step change.
And the step change is massive. And you haven't seen, I think in vision, I would say you're pretty far, you're further progressed as well, but not as
Yeah.
scalable as LLMs have taken off. I think the question and the interesting thing is how do you use
Yep.
the best progression of the models that are right now, and what are you going to bet on progressing?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And this is a technology issue about, again, what are you going to pick for your database, right? What are you going to pick that is, we're not going to have a breakthrough here, right? We're going to bet on XYZ company having the breakthrough. And I think it's absolutely going to be used in many different ways.
Yeah.
And I think we, when in the past, I don't know, 2 years, right? And 2 years ago to a year ago, of course, everything was chatbot, right? And
Mhm.
everything is, hey, chat with this and chat
Right.
with that, right? And you can chat in all these different ways. And I think from our perspective, we saw that as, it's definitely value add.
Mhm.
You can upload your documents, you can upload your data, and you can have a conversation. And the value there is that data is at your fingertips,
Right.
more readily available. There is value, absolutely. For us, I think we always try to think about how are we going to have a differentiated solution with this.
Mhm.
And so we really focus on data entry and recommendations and auto-filling forms and live searching your data, all from a singular experience. Really, it's working back from the
Yeah.
end user and all the workflows that the end user has to do and making that just one, right? Instead of 10.
You mean manual duplicate data entry isn't on the top of the list for
Yeah.
all the field guys'
Yeah.
favorite things to do?
Yeah, exactly.
Like,
Right. Yeah, exactly.
yeah, I've already told you I'm on this well. Actually, I'm on
Yeah.
this well because my phone is here and you
Yes.
know exactly what pad I'm
Yeah,
on and
yeah.
you know when I got here and you
Right.
know, like,
Yeah.
no, I,
So it's reducing all that
Yep.
again, going back to the 80% BS that's happening in
Mhm.
operation from the initial digitization.
one, those are all opportunities for the human to screw it up too,
Yes.
right? Like,
Totally.
anytime you can have a database auto-populate something that you know is right versus having a human input it,
Yep.
do it. Like,
Yeah.
dude,
Totally.
I hate, God, the amount of, forms and manual data
Yeah,
entry stuff with all the
it's-
ERP, CRM stuff
oh
that
my
I've set up
gosh.
is just like,
It's bad.
well, you just don't know until you start getting into it.
Yeah,
And you're
you
like,
don't know,
okay,
yeah.
well name. Why would the well name be anything other than the well name?
Yeah.
Well, you call, you call the superintendent and he's like, yeah, we're on the UL 22. Okay, great. Then you go look up UL 22 and you can't find UL 22. And it's like, oh, well, it's the university lands giant, string.
Mhm.
You're like, okay, well, there's a bunch of university lands
Yeah.
number 22s with different prefaces before that. And so it's like, well, which one is it? Right. And you're just, so yeah, even I laughed earlier when you were talking about, well identifiers, right?
Yep.
Because we've Bobby and Jeff and the whiskey data night stuff that we've done, that's always a topic of debate. It's
Totally.
what is a unique identifier? A unique
Yes.
identifier. How do you do that?
Yep.
What is that based off of? Right.
Yes.
And like, I had never truly thought through that
Yeah.
especially from an operator's perspective, right? And like, that's
Yeah.
a huge thing. That's
Getting
a
that
big
base
can
layer
of worms, right? Like,
and
yeah.
like how you even get that right? Is
Exactly.
like companies are still spending projects and months and
Mhm.
still trying to figure that out, right?
Yep.
And it's a continual effort. But I think LLMs, I mean, you were just talking about document extraction, right?
Mhm.
And then schema construction based off of those documents, right? And so this is a way where, it's not a chatbot, right? But it's picking your underlying structure of how you're going to develop your technology. And I think there's just more areas that's going to be applied to, right? Whether it is models, whether it is retraining, whether it is data labels, whether it is summarizing, whether it is engaging with somebody, whether it is, an agent, agentic workflows and multi-models there. All of this is coming together, right? And so I think that because obviously there's very, there's massive breakthroughs that have happened here. And so you cannot discount that will proliferate in different ways because that has had a massive breakthrough, and we all need to recognize that. And then I think it's a race to say, what am I going to be really good at? Right. And what can I scale here that is differentiated, and that can scale across, the landscape. Integration. Integration, right? Talk about integration, right? There's a better means of doing integration, and LLMs are nicely suited for that.
Yeah, they really are.
Really nicely suited for that. And so how can that be done in a day, in an hour, versus, can you send me the tag list? Okay, let me look at it. Well, let me tell you, and then you can resend me this, and all of that workflow, right, is going to be condensed. And so you have this pain in the ass thing that you have to do now with LLMs. It's condensing.
And that's the thing. Like, people sleep on the value of just this new augmented search retrieval mechanism that are large language models. And that's I tell people all the time, like, they get, everybody's worried about AGI and them being sentient and stuff. It's like, that's not what they are right now.
Right.
Like, who the fuck knows what that looks like. But right now, they are just a better way to discover information that is already in there. Right.
Yeah.
It's not thinking on its own.
And I wouldn't even put it like, I mean, sure, I think there's aspects of that and everything else. You still have to have people, especially in oil and gas, people doing work on assets. That's, and I would probably say there's, some people who say, well, I want the autonomous well site where, nobody has to touch anything. And it's like, look, I understand where you want to get to. And yes, I think everybody's in line with that. But there's so much other low-hanging fruit.
Right.
There's so much other fluff in, I would say, a lot of organizations, because you're dealing with this shitty data management. And so let's try to attack that at the same time. These things can be in parallel process, right? But I think the worker is still going to be doing work on these assets, right? And I think that's definitely going to be the case. Now, all the, talking to regulatory, well, did you fill out the report? Well, can you assign Jim? Well, the well was down, but it needs to be filed for all those things, right? That's all the fluff that I think can be taken out of the system. And so I think what the future holds is that, the office reduces over time. Now, is anybody's job? I mean, it's the same conversations with machine learning and with models and everything else that happen. And, if an organization wants to cut, they'll find a way to cut, right? They can use data as a crutch to make that argument, or they can do it. Right? Like,
that's true.
That's
very true.
It's in both happen. And so everybody's fear of AGI taking over and making decisions and all that. Yes. I mean, it will come maybe over time, but I think there's so much to happen right now that is not that.
That's the thing. I think one of the interesting things about the machine learning AI into the language model stuff has really forced people to understand that, like, data quality, like, we have a shitload of data, but most of it is shit. Like, at the end of the day, from a data engineering perspective, right? And so it's like, they tried all these things and then they realized, oh, well, the data's bad. So we've got to take that step back, and, like, we've got to baby step our way into this. We can't just, and it's the technology hype curve, right? Same thing. I think we're peaking with LLMs right now. Not to say that they're bad or not useful, but again, when people are talking about, oh, they've got AGI, or like, I don't know how much, how I feel about
too much
that.
hype there.
Right. Like, that's a great, again, you're selling the future state, right? Which is what all good startups do. But, I think it's going to be wild to see how all this stuff changes. Because it's just moving so fast. I was running Llama 3 on my laptop earlier this week.
Like,
the
local stuff is so lightweight. Local models, man, is super cool.
That's where I think that I'm seeing a trend, at least on the newer models, is everything is pushing towards speed and efficiency, right? And I think all of that ultimately, Apple just put out theirs, and Microsoft came out with 5.3 and all this stuff. But I think they're all really, the goal of that is they're going to run they're going to run on the edge, essentially, right?
Devices,
And that's another thing people don't think about is it's like I tried to when Llama 2 came out on GCP in Vertex AI, I was like, oh, I'll go stand this up. My estimated cost per month for that one Llama instance was going to be $30,000. I was like, well, there's a reason why they're building these models to be smaller, cheaper, and more efficient, because they don't want to run on your hardware and not on their servers, is because it's expensive as shit. And then it's like, oh yeah, if you're trying to deploy them, you're like, okay, now I get it. It's like I can't keep a server running for $30,000 when I could just go buy one for $30,000, and that's a very tricky kind of balance there. But it's it's gonna. I'm very curious to see how that kind of evolves, because I mean, having it embedded on all your devices is what is going to happen at some point. Which is wild.
Yeah, and I think it goes, it's another avenue where it will infiltrate that median, right? And again, how much value having something on the edge, and how much value is, application, or having it this way, right? Or having it pointed towards Z, right? So I think that's, again, who can do this at scale, right, in the right way? I think that's the interesting question, and there's many different ways to cut that. And I think just observing that, right, is really interesting.
Yeah, that's kind of the cool part now is the industry. Of course, we're always the first ones to copy, right, or the second ones to adopt, essentially. But everybody's been kind of like watching and waiting to see. Like, we're not going to commit to one. We're going to test out a bunch of stuff. But I think ultimately, like, you've got to have, I think the answer is the architecture has to be set up in a way that you can swap models, because there's going to be a better one at some point in the future that may not be the one that you chose. And then what do you do? That's what I don't get. There's so many companies out there building custom models and stuff. And it's like, it's going back to that very first conversation. Like, why are you building instead of just buying and being able to architect it in a way that you can hot swap with an open source thing, or just building with open source? And there's plenty of those out there too, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean,
it's tricky.
There's so many aspects of this. Like even just, there's a trigger where you said, we're just going to swap Model A versus Model B, right? I haven't really seen that been done well at all, or done at all. And so, I think from a generalized perspective, it's like, well, yeah, we want an architecture where but the reality of the situation is, they've got their messy data, or they have all these other compounding issues that they're trying to figure out, and they're so far away from swapping models because they haven't, your foundation layer there is not set. And
you got to crawl before you can run.
Yeah, totally. And again, it's like, how is this all going to work together with what data do you have? What models are you going to spin up off of that? Well, what are you going to try to do? What's the end workflow of that, right? Like, thinking about this from, systematic level, I think is really important. And I think that people are just looking at it from one approach, or everybody's talking about a model. Is like, well, I tried to say, hey, what is my production trend for the month? And it didn't work.
Right.
Well, of course, that's, a data issue, a model, a corpus issue, like all these things, right?
Yeah. How did you chunk it? What embeddings did you use?
Yeah.
Like, there's so
much there's so much in there. At the same time, it's like, well, why are you trying to show what you produce for a week? What's the value there, right? So I think it's both.
It's in the Spotfire dashboard. Just get it from there, right? Like,
in some dashboards, that that there's 1,000 of,
right?
But it's twofold, right? It's what is the value of what you're trying to achieve, and it's also like there's a lot of intricacies in just getting that set up from and not even talking about swapping models. It's like, can you get that to a point where like what are you trying to achieve with that?
Just your data pipeline for that. Totally. That's why we're pretty heavily betting on the RAG side of things, because especially for what we're talking about, which is just search. Essentially.
Retrieval.
That at least allows you to swap the models out, because you're vector database is your vector database. It doesn't matter which model is calling it. As long as you can get that part of it
Yep.
as good as you possibly can,
Yes.
then you can find which off-the-shelf model is best at
Yes.
retrieving
Totally.
that. But
Yeah.
that's a very unique instance, right?
No, for
Most
sure.
other people are not. It's not a
Yeah.
they're not building on a RAG architecture, or we're
Yep.
talking about machine learning and
Right.
different things where it's it's not nearly as easy to do that.
Yes,
right?
yeah. No, absolutely. And even with retrieval, right, there's many different ways to approach it and to have success with it. So
Yep.
yeah, the vectorization is super, super interesting. And I think holds so much power.
Yep.
And even just choosing the right architecture about, and there's a million databases that do vectorization, right? So pick your flavor.
Mhm.
Start with Pinecone, right? Go from there.
Yep.
But then that is a question of
No, that's the
are
very
you gonna
first
use this
thing,
for
right?
vectorization, and then your other data is going to sit where, and
Mhm.
it's not going to be in Pinecone, and it's going to be over here and here, and what's the system that can manage this all? And so then you're going back to architecture and what systems are you picking there?
Yep.
So yeah, all these things are very important. But you're approaching this from an investor standpoint. What tool, what software system is going to continue to grow in
Right.
this way where it's going to encapsulate these future issues that we're thinking about doing?
Yeah.
And so you have to approach it from an investor perspective as well. How much money have they raised?
Yep.
Are they capital efficient? Are they doing the right things? Do they have an amazing product? Do they have an eye for product, an eye for details?
Team.
The team, right?
So
and so as you're picking software, you have to approach it, even if you're building as a software company or within an EMP, you have to approach it from, hey, is this team going to be doing amazing
Right.
things, or where are they going? And am I going to bet on them going in this direction in the
Yeah.
right way? And if that bet doesn't come true, then you're reframing everything,
Yeah.
right? Then you're pulling everything out again, and you're trying to restructure everything.
Right. Or was their Git repo updated in the last 6 months?
Yeah.
Right. Like, it's a good sign. People don't check that near enough.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, I found this cool Git library. It's like, well, it's 4 years old.
Yeah.
And
there's no commits.
There's a bunch of outstanding issues, no new commits. And so I'm not going to build on that.
Yeah. Exactly.
Probably we're not gonna do.
Yeah. I found it via Twitter thread.
Right.
Yeah.
I got fed to me. I get so much shit on my Instagram algorithm feeds me all this wonderful stuff.
Yeah.
And so it's it's always fun though, then to go be like, okay, well, this guy clearly got paid to make a reel about this, or has an affiliate or whatever, right? Like, I need to actually go try this and see if it actually is what it says it is.
Totally.
But man, we're already past time. So that was quick.
Hour,
That was
10 minutes,
fun.
man. Goes by quick.
Well,
I can talk about this stuff all day,
Same.
as I know you can as well.
Yeah.
So I enjoy the conversation.
Yeah, I appreciate you coming. We wrap it up at the end, but I wanted to just give some props to another TU alum. Go Golden Hurricanes.
Oh yeah. Bring it back, baby.
Yeah.
Bring it back.
And but so at the end we kind of just do like a speed round, and I'll pepper you with some random stuff. But
Let's do it.
favorite kind of social follow, pick your platform.
Yeah, I'm we're on LinkedIn, we're on Twitter, and I have not been posting, have just been, head down building. I would say that's my default.
Yep.
But we're kind of coming up with a marketing campaign and everything else post this for our new releases.
Nice.
But yeah, Twitter and LinkedIn, main sources.
Any specific people on there that you think others should follow in the tech or energy space?
Oh,
I know that's always a hard one because it's off the top.
Any specific people to follow? I would say for me, I don't have a person in mind specifically. I'm definitely following a lot of the companies that are doing different aspects of AI right now, and using it in different ways.
Right.
And so really kind of seeing, and it's really interesting, right? You have the foundational companies, of course, and you have the retrieval, specific packages and different startups there. You have the vector databases and how is this being used across the board, and who's going for the vision, the LLM, the PDFs, the enterprise data, who's going after different segments of the market. And so I think that's something that I stay pretty close to, just on seeing where it's going. But At the same time, as we talked about before, you can't get caught up in it. You just have to go head down and
Yep.
build off of your end goal for what's going to drive value specific to the user. And
Yeah.
so that's really the focus.
What about books, either startup or tech?
Books. I read a lot of books before starting Tasq, and
when you had free time?
since starting Tasq, it's more so been less about that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think learning mindset by Carol Dweck is or growth mindset is
that's
a
a
key one, right? That's really kind of reframing just how you think about life, right?
Yeah.
How you think about success in your company, how you think about, and everything
It's
is learning,
literally
right?
everything.
It
Like,
is, and so
I'm gonna make my kids read that in high school, I think,
Yeah.
because
It's
I
so important.
genuinely think that can literally change
Yes.
your life,
Agreed.
the way that you perceive and approach things.
Yeah, and it's are you going to think in a box,
Mhm.
and are you going to think that success is in that box?
Yeah.
And it's super interesting, right? And how you reframe your mind. It's just
Mhm.
reframing your mind about how you're thinking about failure outside of
Yeah.
that box. And it's not even failure, right?
Right.
Failure is such a shitty word to use. It's iteration.
Yep.
And
Well,
are you going to iterate, or are you going to be confined?
Yeah, it also, to me, helped really it explained a lot of the business side of things too, right? Where it's like, they talk about, okay, well, certain companies chase the quarterly earnings
Mhm,
calls because
mhm,
they want their stock to perform well. Well,
mhm.
chasing quarterly earnings calls typically is not a great long-term strategy for
Totally.
a company to continue to exist. And then
Totally.
you look at the growth mindset companies like the Apples of the world and those folks, and it's like, oh, that's a very different company, right?
Yeah.
Like the long-term game,
Yep.
the infinite game
Yes.
of this is very
Yes.
different than
Yeah.
chasing the quarterly
Totally.
EPS, right?
Yeah, I think the same thing happens in startups.
Absolutely.
Going to our initial point, because you have to build this initial product, right? And so you're furiously building this, and somewhat of that is short term,
Yeah.
right? But at the same time, there's so many aspects of, you want a good client referral and you want it to continue to
Right.
grow in the right way. And so someone have to do this. And so there's always this balance. But to your point, having a long-term vision that you're building around is the key most important thing for startups at the early stage, public companies, and it's the most healthy way to continue to grow,
Yeah.
right? Because you're growing with an aligned state.
Yep.
And that's very clear to everybody, right? So
Yeah, getting everybody rowing in the same direction is
totally.
very understated.
Yes.
in
Yes.
my mind,
Yeah,
for
no,
sure.
100%. I mean, just in how you build, right?
Yep.
Like, 10% misalignment drastically slows things down. And so focus on 99% alignment, right? And nobody's going to be totally aligned, but that's how you move quick.
Right.
That's how you iterate.
Well, minimize the places where they can't be,
Yes,
right? Like
totally.
one of the things I do now, I almost require it, but if there's a feature request or a bug that's visual, it needs a mock-up or a screenshot or whatever. It needs the visual because it's going to go to a developer.
Yep.
And the developer may or may not have any idea what we're talking about or the context.
Totally.
And so guess what? If there's a mock-up, they can't screw that up.
Yep.
Right. I can't tell you how many times I've put in feature requests or new features, bugs, whatever, just with text.
Yep.
And then the developer checks it off because it does, the feature exists and it works, but it is not intuitive or useful or make any sense in any way, but they check the box, right?
Yep.
Totally. Last one. I'll do two more. Favorite video or board game?
Favorite video game or board game? My brother is an expert board game player, and so he knows everything about board games, and so he really leads me in that capacity. But I haven't played board games in a while too. Like my daughters are just growing up, and so they're 7 and 5, and so I definitely want to get them into board games. But we're just reaching the point where you start playing some more interesting ones than Candyland.
Yeah,
so
Bluey-opoly.
I'm currently stuck on Candyland. I'm hoping to move to Monopoly as a secondary, and then go into strategy games.
We got some kind of, I think it's Bluey-opoly. Yeah, and
Blue,
so it's Bluey.
Yeah.
Bluey-opoly. It's pretty good, but it's just, it's still Monopoly, so it still takes forever because they're children.
Yeah.
And then you're like, oh man, I didn't realize you could be like, my kids are the same age, 5 and 7, and it's like, oh, I didn't know you had the capacity to to come in and just dominate an entire section of the board. And like, my younger one, he'll just buy them every time he lands on a spot, right? And my daughter will wait until she gets all the way around to the last two edges. And I'm like, oh, you're picking up on this stuff.
That's good. I like it.
Or then you play Chutes and Ladders, and it's just pure randomness, and you always end up losing. The person leading always ends up losing. Right? Like, I hate this game. Last one. What's some advice you would give to somebody that's looking at starting their own software energy tech company that you wish you knew or had when you
man, great question. There's definitely a few things. I would say go for it. Number one, go for it. Life is too short, man. Life is too short to hold back on doing that. I think going back to growth mindset, you learn so much. I learned so much about the business. I learned so much about engaging with clients. I learned so much about how to build the right tech. All these different facets that I didn't know about before, right? So taking that plunge, I think is, if you're curious about it, it's such an exciting time to be building.
And it's okay not to know this. Like,
everyone
doesn't know those things when they don't know everything when you start. And that's part of the journey.
And just do it, right? Reach out to, 100 people via cold message, try to say the other thing, right? When I was starting out, everybody's supportive of somebody taking a risk to go do something. And so you have that with you, and go engage people, go send DMs. Everybody's going to help you out. Everybody's going to give you the time. I mean, there's so many people in the beginning that gave me time when we were like 4 months in, had like nothing, right? And, Chris Wright and all these people, right? They're really kind to give their time and just to listen to us, right? And so know that you have this inertia when you start out that can be contagious. And it's very much in a positive way. Life is too short, so just go for it. The things that I wish I would have done differently. I think in the beginning, we were somewhat too confident that we could run this as a completely bootstrapped company with no capital. And so we underestimated what it took to really get into the market, what it took to start scaling, what it took to build this, differentiated AI and this technology stack that we believe is completely going to have an unlock. And so, you don't know what you don't know in the beginning, and you kind of have to reframe and consistently reframe. And that's the name of the game. Is you have to
iteration.
You find some shitty news, Friday morning. Well, you have to come up with a plan in the next 2 hours to address it. And then you execute the plan in the next 2 hours, right? And then things are better. And so, it's definitely a level of masochism that you have to go through, and you have to enjoy kind of getting sucker punched. But, don't do that all on your budget.
No, for sure.
Go try to talk to the right capital providers. And I think we were too, I would say, confident that we could do it on our own. And that, I think, definitely capped us a little bit.
Chuck tells Colin every time he talks about fundraising, he's like, well, I've never met a startup founder that was disappointed that that was upset that they raised too much money.
Right. Yeah. You can always talk about valuations in the future, and you have to down round and all these things. But look, you've got capital at your disposal. Like, go run, make something big.
Yeah. Again, the CEO's job is to keep the company alive, and you can't do that if you don't have enough capital to, to keep the lights on and keep moving forward.
And you either do that through just just going through it and selling and getting up in front of people and not taking no and really spending your time there. But I think the last thing, just to leave it on, is just really think about, do your research on what's going to make you different. You have a perspective out there. Number one, go for it. But number two, really reframe how that is different than what other people believe. And go deep on that, and hold that perspective and be confident about that.
Yeah, because everyone's going to tell you it's not going to work, or it's a bad idea.
Oh my gosh! In the beginning, we had people. We presented at a conference. We had, like, I won't name names, but we had some CVCs that just came back to us, and we didn't even engage with them. Yeah, and they completely just tore us a new one in like 3 minutes. Ranting back to us on how what we're doing is never going to work. And you just have to be able to take that, right? And I think any type of emotion invoked in what you're doing is a good thing, right? And you have to be confident to stay the course, that your perspective is different, and continue to go that direction. And you know what? If you're 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, whatever down the line, and that's not the case, it's okay.
Yeah.
Right? You learn.
No, I mean,
you continue to grow, right?
That's the
And so
biggest thing.
it's all just about learning and pursuing your passion. And so for anybody listening, if they want to reach out to me and they're interested, I'll be gladly to share all the knowledge that I have with anybody who's interested in starting their own thing, because it's worth it.
Absolutely. It only takes one too.
Yeah, absolutely.
All the famous people that everybody hears about and thinks of, it's because of the one thing.
Yep.
That doesn't mean that they didn't have 20 failures before that, right?
Totally.
And again, I agree with you wholeheartedly. Failures are lessons, like
Yep.
hard stop.
Yes.
Right? Like,
yeah,
they should be.
And
if you don't learn from
really,
them, maybe.
Yeah, I would I want to categorize failure in a different way, right? Because people always say, yeah, growth mindset and this, and failure is not failure. It's iteration.
Yeah.
The failure should be scraped
Right.
out of
It
people's
was just the wrong way of doing it.
It's just you're talking about iteration here, right? You're not talking about failure. You're talking about iteration. And so if I could change one thing, let's take that out of the dictionary.
That's
right?
perfect.
Yeah.
Where can people find you in Tasq?
Find me on Twitter at Wes_Hamer. And then on LinkedIn, Wes Hamer as well. Shoot me a DM. Happy to talk.
Is it Tasq.io?
Tasq.io. Yep.
Okay, cool. Wes, thanks so much for coming on, man.
John,
Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me,
It's
man.
been a pleasure.
Absolutely.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see y'all next time.